and she's going to be presenting on inspiring learner voice through racial and social justice in UDL, which, if you're not familiar with, is Universal Design for Learning. And I know she will explain that more to you. Just so you know, we will be recording. So I wanted to give everyone a heads up that if you don't want to be on that, you're welcome to mute yourself and turn off your camera. And that will take care of any kind of having you be seen on a video. So if you'd like to do that now, and then Carrie, if you'd like to go ahead and push the record button.
I think she already did. It popped up on my screen already.
I heard a ding. I think with that, Jill, I will let you take over, and our ed tech people will be in the chat and possibly talking when appropriate. But if you have questions or need to talk in the background, feel free to put something in the chat and we'll answer.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. I have two screens, two monitors going on here. So just trying to toggle between the two and see what we've got going on. I'm really excited to be here with you today. Thank you for joining on your Tuesday afternoon. I hope you all have had a great day. We'll be talking about inspiring learner voice through racial and social justice in UDL. So in this session, we'll be talking about how to incorporate universal design for learning through a racial justice and social justice lens. And I am so excited to have you all here with me today. The first thing I want to talk about is STEM for Real. We support educators. I'm so excited to have you in this corner of the internet with me. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is STEM for Real, and this is our organization where we support educators in standards-based STEM and literacy instruction through culturally responsive and relevant lessons and experiences. A lot of the work that we're going to be talking about has been vetted, by field tested, and we want to make sure that we practice what we preach. So we make sure that educators and ourselves are using universal design for learning, and we always talk about how to connect, create, and cultivate anti-racist and anti-biased experiences in your classroom. Just a little bit about me and about our founder, Dr. Lena Bakshi. She is a math and science specialist and instructional coach and teacher. She may be popping on the call in a little bit. It depends. She has a newborn baby, so it depends how things go with that. She's a pre-service teacher and adjunct professor, county administrator for many, many years, and a STEM education researcher and the executive director of STEM for Real. My name is Jill Watson. I am a STEM for Real project manager and instructional coach. I've been in the classroom for 18 years, and that spans from, all the way from TK up through middle and high school and college level. I have my master's degree is in restorative justice, and I enjoy giving presentations on how to use that in the classroom and how to manage behaviors with that. And I am a really strong social justice advocate. We've been doing this work. I've been doing this work pre and post pandemic and during the pandemic also. So I have a lot of experience knowing how it is in the classroom to be an educator with pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic learners in the classroom, and how much education has shifted across those, what was it, like 3 years now? It feels like much longer, but 3 years. So who is this session for? This session is for anyone that is in education. We at STEM for Real want to ensure that we are reaching out to our new teachers. We also want to make sure that we are reaching out to teacher leaders, educational coaches, instructional coaches, whomever supports you in your classroom, and make sure that we support teachers who are new to social justice and justice-centered pedagogy. We really want to be strong in that and ensure that we're doing all the great work. So we want to support the teachers, support all of you, support everybody, and have great time together. The way we started, Dr. Lena, the person that I talked about initially, wrote this book, There's Something in the Water. And the way that she came to that is that she saw, like similar to all of us, a lack of diversity in the schools and cultural resources. Our story started with a story, There's Something in the Water. We wanted to showcase the life and times of Dr. Tyrone Hayes from UC Berkeley, world-renowned endocrinologist, and show young people that yes, there are Black people, brown people, and other people that we don't normally see in STEM, to ensure that we are creating a sense of belonging in our students. And sometimes it's as simple as one children's book that can make a difference. It started with a story, but now we have worked with many schools and districts to create equitable opportunities and images within STEM so students can see themselves in STEM. We believe that our vision is that we believe each and every single child, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, that they should see themselves in STEM, the STEM field. And the funny thing is that STEM and science is everywhere. It's all around us. And yet we as educators tend to gatekeep those who we think should do STEM and who we think should be involved in STEM learning. It's not intentional. It's just something that sometimes we do, but we want to make sure that everybody gets access to STEM content and curriculum. And that is what we are looking to change. So our learning outcomes for today, for this next hour that we have, a little less than an hour, we want to show the beautiful marriage between universal design for learning and how it overlays with the 5 E's of instruction. So that's engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate, and then dig deeper into what truly equitable and culturally responsive teaching means, especially when we connect standards-based instruction and how we can connect the standards to the lived experiences and identities of our students. Then we're going to review a sample lesson plan courtesy of a teacher that we partner with named Samantha. And we'll look at creating our own culturally responsive phenomenon using STEM for Reals formula and the standard, hook, and society, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So who belongs in STEM? In the chat really quick, I want you to pop in who you think belongs in STEM. What sort of person belongs in STEM? I know my brother belongs in STEM. He's a scientist. He's a biologist. My dad is a biologist or a chemist. My sister is a, what is she? She is a biochemist. So who do you think belongs in STEM? I'm going to pause for just a minute so we can have some ideas of who you belongs in STEM and maybe even who your students think belong in STEM, because that's even more important than just what we all think. So should it be the honor students? Should it be the high achieving students? Should it be the advanced students of color? Should it be really anybody? What do you think? Pop into the chat either what you think students think who belongs in STEM, or who you think belongs in STEM. Yes, Jorge, thank you. Yes, women, Kelly, thank you. Do you think your students see themselves as belonging in STEM? Your artist daughter, that's tough. Creative, curious, and listening differently. All your students think, Steph. Agreed that all people belong in STEM. Sometimes STEM appropriate students are not honors, but need STEM to engage in academics overall. You all win. Thank you. Yes, you can still pop in those answers down there into the chat if you did not have an opportunity to do so yet. I'm going to continue on because your time is valuable and I want to make sure that we use the most of our time. So everybody, like you all said, everyone belongs in STEM, and yet we see the same faces continually. We see white males, white males, white males, white males, white males, white males, right? It's slowly starting to change, and the narrative is changing, but we really need to have it change drastically, especially when you think about your students. Can they see themselves in your instruction? And that is the question that we want to ask. We want Dr. Ina Johnson making waves in the ocean. She just happens to be the ocean scientist. And we have Dr. Tyrone Hayes and a very special person, this gentleman in the middle, that is Lena's husband. He is a native Hawaiian that was typically labeled as not a math person and not really going anywhere. And now he is working on his PhD in mechanical engineering. So you see how this journey of how people may not have demonstrated their knowledge in the way that we want them to in our traditional schooling spaces. And yet we see that this journey isn't done for them. It isn't there. It isn't at the end. And we want to be able to, as educators, to continue to pave the way and open doors for everyone. So yes, how can we as educators dismantle the narrative, the current narrative that is to show that and expand the faces of STEM education. Let's go and ahead and look at some of the root causes of inequity in STEM. I'm going to pause for you all to get this. I'm sure none of this is a surprise to you or shocking to you that's on this slide, but you can see that there's a lack of diversity in STEM fields. That could be one way that we talk about it. You can also see that some people think of social justice and anti-racism as maybe that's for the humanities and for like ethnic study courses, but that's not STEM. And that's not science, and not anybody needs to have that in science. We don't have time for that. We have limited amount of time within science. But we also see a lack of representation in STEM curriculum, or lack of even the teachers that are represented. Do they mirror your student population? Where is the diversity in the STEM teachers? I know in my school that I work in, there's not that much diversity within the STEM educators. Some people say that there's no time to teach and address issues of inequity because we have to teach Common Core. We have to teach language. Many students with disabilities, they are not taught science because there's this perceived notion that they can't do science, which we all know is not true. There's also this growing population of like the lack of similar-minded colleagues that want to do this work. Some people feel like they're doing it in a silo and don't have a community to build among. And some people are labeled that they just can't do this work, like Dr. Lena's husband. There are people that don't know what CRT is, but they don't want it. They're like, nah, nothing with this CRT. And a lot of this work is actually, we learn a lot about critical race theory through doing this work. And a lot of this work in particular has nothing to do with critical race theory. This is work simply about diversifying and showcasing the voices in STEM and the cultural experience that STEM is in STEM. And that's it. And that's okay. So when we think about STEM, when we think about inequity, we think about social justice and injustice. There's this blame game. We want to blame the elementary teachers for not teaching science, or we blame the administrators for everything. And yet we want to know where it's coming from. And it's not necessarily coming from one place. If you think about our schools, they were built on the foundation of Brown versus Board of Education, very racist policy that when we look at it, the history of segregation and desegregation and the policies and the processes that came with that, many of these systems are still in place today. So that is why there is a huge systemic problem. So what if we could do both? What if we could do anti-racism and anti-bias instruction and address the STEM content standards and thus make STEM for real for all? And that's what we're wanting to look into doing today. So this is our framework at STEM for Real. We start with the phenomenon, and doesn't necessarily have to be just with STEM. You can use Standard Hook Society for any of your instruction, whether it's English or language arts or history or social science. You want to think of that hook. You want to think of that engagement that we want to get. Then we're going to talk about the 3D 5E. Now the 3Ds come down straight from the next generation science standards. You've probably heard of them or have some familiarity with them. But again, it doesn't have to be just for science. The 3Ds are the practice, the core idea, and the cross-cutting concept. So what we like to do, what are the students doing? That's what the concept is, what the concept is, what they do, what they're digging into, and what they need to know and how they're thinking about the instruction. Then, of course, we'll look at the 5 E's, then look at how we are actively thinking about community, belonging, and anti-racism, using the learning for justice, social justice standards. And then finally, my most favorite part is that we will reflect on how this was a joyful experience for us as the educators. Yes, we as educators, we need to be having fun. It's the most important part, that pure actual joy, cultivating joy straight from Dr. Goldie Mohammed, is that we want to cultivate joy, not because we're having fun, well, because we want to have fun, but we also want the students to have fun. And if we're having fun, the students are having fun. So we want to make sure that we're cultivating that joy as well. So where does universal design fit in? And the answer is everywhere. UDL is the center to your framework. We are constantly going to be looking at these 3 domains of engagement, representation, action, and expression. So we're going to be looking at these opportunities for engagement for our students. We'll be looking at how the content is represented using the 5 E's. We'll be looking at action and expression, and how students are going to be able to interact with their content and express their knowledge. So when we think about the 3 areas of UDL, we have engagement, representation, and action and expression. And now what does that look like when we overlay this with the framework of do, know, think? What we're saying is that there are 2 frameworks that can overlay with each other. So do, what are the students doing? That goes on how the content is being represented. And now what does that look like when we overlay it with this framework of do, know, think? We're saying that there is the thing, the 2 frameworks connect. Oops, I just said. And they come back together. So what are their actions? What are their expressions? What are the students doing? Know is the content knowledge, and think is how they are thinking across these cross-cutting concepts, such as patterns, causes, and effect. Causes and effect, structure, and function. Those are what we want to see. So let's start with the 5 Ds. Can you give me a thumbs up if you are familiar with the 5D, 5E lesson plan? Again, the 3 Ds are the do, know, think, and the 5 Es are engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. Love it. I love those thumbs ups. Thank you. Then we're going to notice that we're going to use the universal design for learning to inform our next steps. It's not necessarily a checklist, but a place map for us to evaluate how our lesson is going to be coming. So it's really important that you know that this is not something that you're going to be like, check, 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 done, 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 but just a method for how to look at things and how to look at your learning that you're offering. We need to ask ourselves these 3 questions. How will the students engage? How will the students perceive information through representation? And how will the students act on their understanding through their action and expression? So we're going to look at it side by side and do the do, know, think for universal design for learning. Let's start with your why. I want you to pause and answer these questions. You don't have to type them out. You can just think about it in your head. How are you recruiting interest in your lessons? I doubt that many of your students are running, saying, yes, yes, let's learn about photosynthesis. I love this. This is great. Or maybe some of them are, and I would love to know your secrets of what they're doing. But I'm pretty sure your average student is, thinking about social media, what they're going to do at lunch, maybe not your instructions. So we need to figure out how we can connect the why. And more than just engagement, we want to ensure that students are able to persist through the lesson. Because yes, there's going to be times when the students have to know what the components of photosynthesis, the components of the photosynthesis equation are, and what chlorophyll is. So they're going to have to persist through that lesson, but we have to hook them there first. We have to hook them to get them to that lesson, to get that excitement building within them. So how will your students be hooked? And what evidence are you going to gather from your students? How will you know that your students learned? And now let's think about representation, the what. What are the ways that your students perceive the information? How do you promote understanding across languages? This is where we want to bring in more of that academic discourse. How do we get students to make sense, talk and engage and ideate on the information? How do you support student comprehension and understanding? So again, this is where all of the 5 E's are going to come into play. We need to ask ourselves, when we're thinking about explaining and lecturing, how can we come up with other ways that students can comprehend and understand? I know we're all really great at differentiating our instruction, so this is really important to dig into that. And how are we going to differentiate our lessons and our learning? And then action and expression. How do you vary methods for response and navigation? That means, how do you gather all the different types of responses from your students? How can you support your students navigating through the lesson? Maybe you need to have some resources in their native language. What multiple tools do you use for expression and communication? Is it PowerPoint? Do you use Google Docs? Are you using Are you using audio and video recording? Are they writing, reading, and other ways that students can express their knowledge? And how will you monitor student progress? This is what's most important, because Loretta Hammond talks about self-regulation and independent learners. We need to foster that sense of independence and student learning and have them take that learning and run with it. We are so great at differentiating our instruction, and sometimes we're not so great at differentiating our methods for collecting that information from the students. All right, so now what about the anti-racism and justice-centered pedagogy? Where does it all fit in? Great question. So when you think of this, I want you to think of how this all overlays. Take a look at it. I'm assuming the deck I can provide to you all later. You can take a screenshot of this if you want to, of how UDL and the 5 E's overlap. Let's get into our 5 E's. And we're going to start with the introduction of our phenomenon. We'll dig deeper into what that phenomenon can look like when you engage with the phenomenon on that, when those opportunities for engagement come in. In UDL instruction, explore is where you can think of different activities, this top, or the second E. You can think of different activities to make sense of the phenomenon. So this would be monitoring with different experiments, inquiry-based, images, looking at images, making sense of observations, watching videos, watching demonstrations. These are those activities that are going to allow for students to make sense of their phenomenon and learn a little bit more. We like to call this the activity before content, the ABC, activity before content. And then we move into the explain. Notice that explain comes after all of that. So the activity before content. This is your content. So this is where students are gaining their informational text. Perhaps they're learning more about conceptual models. They're creating their own conceptual models. This is where they are perhaps obtaining a lecture, vocabulary, anchor charts. All of this can come here because this is where they can attach the content and the activities that they just experienced. So you don't want to teach in a silo. You want to make those connections with the engage and explore before you dig into the explain. And then the final E right here is elaborate. One of my favorite E's. It's when they get to explore the information and content in a different context. So for example, let's say you're learning about photosynthesis and you're learning about farming and agriculture. Well, now they can explain why there are food deserts. That's something that we've heard about often in the news. And can they explain the impact of droughts, which in California we have a lot of. And using that knowledge of what they know about photosynthesis to dig into the really prevalent information that's going on. So you can see that it's different in a different context. It's just in a different context. Like in driving, I don't know if you've ever driven in LA traffic, but it's very different than driving in the suburbs or in sort of in a space that doesn't have traffic. So it's a different context. You know how to drive, but you need to learn how to drive in a different space with different things coming at you. Similarly, we want them to have the skills and the knowledge and use it in a different context. And finally, down here, the last one is to evaluate. A lot of us tend to use Scantrons, multiple choice questions, those sort of things to evaluate. And this is where we want to consider other opportunities to evaluate, such as classroom science talks. You can do you can have students craft a final conceptual model. They can make a claim, evidence, and reasoning, and use that evidence to support their thinking and to support their claim. So there's many different ways that you can incorporate different methods to evaluate, and that's where the action comes in. So you've got your engage, got the UDL on this side and the 5 E's. What is the content and how it is represented to the students? And then you have action and expression, which is the how. So we have the why, the what, the how, the engagement, the why, the representation of what we're learning, and then the action expression of how they're going to be learning it. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper with an example of a lesson. Again, you can engage with your posing a question for where your students are, asking those questions and driving questions. You can watch engaging videos. You can show engaging demonstrations. You could have somebody come in and talk to your students. You could get some thought-provoking phenomenon. And there's also a technique called question formulation technique. And there's a driving question board. And I highly recommend using those tools to introduce engaging phenomenon. So this is what Samantha, earlier I referenced Samantha, one of our partner teachers. This is what she posed to her students. She broke down the US Census racial demographic data. And you can see what students are thinking about in this data. What do they notice? What do they wonder? Pop into the chat. What do you think your students would, if you showed them this data, what would they notice? What would they wonder? What does this graph tell you? Anybody? What do you notice with the chart, the tables? What do you think your students would notice? That's sometimes a safer thing to mention, is what your students might notice. You might look at the graphic, excuse me, and we can start exploring about the percentages of the different racial demographics in their own community. They can look at all sorts of different things and dig into what does this actually mean for us and ourselves. Now we're going to jump into explore. So that was the engage. Now we're going to explore. We've gotten the students interested in race and demographics. They're able to connect it to their race. And so now we can get their feet wet. Now let's nudge them a bit into the water so they can get more into the lesson. So this is where you can add in some simulations, online simulations. You can look at some of the home science experiments that your science content and curriculum has for them. You can look at interactive activities such as a card sort or looking through different images and whatnot. So there's many things that you can do here and that you might want to do to get your students engaged into this interactive model. This is where Samantha, our sample teacher, our partner teacher, brought in different pictures. So here she has different pictures of ecosystems. She's posing the question, which of these ecosystems is healthiest and why? Pop into the chat which one you think is the healthiest and why. My chat doesn't scroll down. The first picture, this one. Oh yes, thank you, Haley, about the map. What would your students notice about the ones with the most diversity? Yes. I mean, you might notice that there's a lot of animals in this one, but not a lot of plants. You might notice that this has a lot of the same plants, so not very diverse. This one over here has a lot of different plants, but there I don't see any animals. You may think that maybe this one is the healthiest ecosystem, the one in the upper left quadrant up here, because you see a lot of diversity, a lot of different animals there, different plants. There's a waterfall. You can kind of see the sunlight coming in. So you can kind of see different ways that what your students would come up with as to which picture, which image is the most diverse ecosystem. And we haven't even done any instruction or any conversation or any teaching about diversity or anything. We haven't mentioned any of that yet. We're just having this conversation, having the students engage. And then this is where explain comes in. So this is where students can listen to a variety of lectures, videos, looking at drafting, going back to the questions that they drafted, seeing if they can explain more, seeing if they maybe want to watch a series or documentaries. They can revise their models. They can use their models to explain to each other. The most important part about the explain is that it doesn't just have to be coming from the teacher. It can go from student to student, student to teacher. It could be multiple different things, not just, so we want to make sure that it's not just you lecturing to the students, but that we're having a conversation and that it comes from multiple different spaces. This is where Samantha was able to demonstrate and introduce vocabulary into the conversation. They talked about variability, diversity, talked about life and what happens there. There's just all of this genetic diversity and what's going on. So you can, Samantha also talked about purebred animals and royalty breeding and how that affected different populations. And then you see here that diversity works well for human and health. And that's what's the concepts that have been brought in. So talking about this, having this conversation, talking about all the different things that come together to make a really great, healthy, diverse environment. And then you jump into the elaborate part, where we get to take the information that we've learned from this lesson and can apply it to a different context. So we do additional activities that can generate additional ideas, that can tap into our brains a little bit more. Now we're going to pose questions of why biodiversity and social justice are connected. We're going to take this idea and this concept of biodiversity and diverse ecosystems and healthy ecosystems, and we're going to connect it to the social justice issues about diversity. And we can connect it in so many things. Just what happens with the environmental issues when they lack biodiversity, and then we can connect it to human populations that are plagued with environmental issues. For example, looking at when there are storms and when there are hurricanes, the very first set of people tend to be affected, the first set of people affected tend to be those that are living in poverty. They don't have resources or the infrastructure to be built up, and that's where some of the most damages occur. And so thinking about that, you can look at how pollutions affect different areas. There's pollution in Oakland versus the rates of pollution of, say, like the coastal area of Santa Cruz. So you can see how it's different in populations and different races and ethnicities, and just how biodiversity and socioeconomic levels really affect everything. And now we can evaluate. We can look back and see how we can capture what students are learning and how they are learning that information and how they are showing it to you and how they can show you that they've learned the information that you've taught. If you give a Scantron test or multiple choice questions, you might be able to get a little window into what students are thinking. But here we really want, and by here, I mean all of us in this space really want a larger window. And that larger window is going to come through modeling and through written assessments that can get at that. So Samantha here chose two very simple questions. What is the infographic showing you? Do you think the state of California is a healthy society? Why or why not? So in these questions, you can see that students are analyzing and interpreting data. They're looking at this data set and they will be engaging and analyzing data while they showing that they know how to read an infographic. Then they know the content. The content is still on biodiversity. And she's conducting biodiversity in human populations, particularly racial demographics. And then finally thinking, we're using patterns to see what we can say about the state. Is California a healthy society? Why or why not? Do you see that the do, know, think you saw in the 5 E's and how they were broken down now? And then after the lesson has been designed, you can use the universal design for learning placemat to see how there are opportunities for engagement. Another concept I want to discuss is having choice. Having choices available so that perhaps students can make a video presentation or they can make a PowerPoint presentation. As a mom of somebody who learns differently, my son is dyslexic and ADHD, he really appreciates having those opportunities to show that he knows what he knows in a different method rather than writing something out or answering questions on a test. So creating that opportunity for students to maybe recording or make a video recording or an audio recording, something where the content is similar, but the way they express their knowledge and their information that they know is there. We want them to have that autonomy piece. You were able to come here. We all love having autonomy. You're able to come here and choose to be in this session with us, and you chose to be here. So you chose to have that strength, and that ability to choose is really key. Having autonomy allows for deeper learning, and then also having that voice. So being able to provide voice and choice, and getting more into those classroom discussions, group learning, having discourse and academic discourse, and being able to have these interactive experiences where students are able to express themselves and express what they've learned. These are some of the ways that we can increase representation in our lessons. So you could have maybe increased discussions on personalized learning plans, thought-provoking lessons. I know there are a lot of thoughts around AR-15's gun control, looking at interactive learning experiences. When you're having classroom discussions, this isn't just a whole group discussion where the teacher is answering back to the student questions. We want the teacher to be more of a facilitator and moderator within this field, more of a referee in a soccer match per se, instead of like a tennis match where they're volleying things back and forth to the teacher. We want you to be there to facilitate, to be more of the role of a referee, making sure that everybody's getting heard and having their opportunity. You could also have small group talk where the students can have that time to sit and talk and look at each other and engage with each other. A lot of times students are more comfortable in small group sessions. However, you want to make sure that it's very, 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 very planned, and that you have structure set also, because we want it to be where they're actually talking about the prompt. A lot of times I would send students off to talk about a prompt, and they would start talking about what they did over the weekend or whose birthday is coming up. But we want them to really talk about the prompt. So this is where you have to be very specific with your students and make sure that they're there to discuss what you want them to discuss. Make sure you're walking around, monitoring what's going on, paying attention to the talk as well. And that's the same thing for partner talk. In the classroom, I like to give, after I lecture for 10 minutes, and this is much longer than that, but after I talk for 10 minutes or give explanation, I like to give about a 2-minute turn and talk where they have time to process what I've given them instruction to do. During that time, I'm moving around the classroom, monitoring what's going on, and having that conversation time, talking about what did we just talk about? What did you hear? What did you hear? What did you learn? And making sure they're having those engaging conversations with their partner. I also like to think about personalized learning experiences. And this is because, especially after the pandemic, we have had a lot of issues in my school with chronic absenteeism. Many students are staying home, and some are being homeschooled or getting independent study. So this is where we can really think about personalized learning programs and plans so that students can learn and get access to the content in different and personalized ways. This can be a series of videos that they can watch, a series of experiments they can do at home. And what I want to really think about is when students are on independent study, that we're not just popping them in front of a computer and putting them in front of the screen. So many ed tech companies are incredible, and they're really excited to get teachers out of the way so they can have their space. But we don't want teachers replaced. We know that that's not what's best for students, because as an educator, you need to connect and make that connection with students. And that's what makes learning most engaging and most incredible, is when we have that personalized learning ability within students and we have that connection to them. It's very different than popping them on Ingenuity. Not to knock Ingenuity, it's great. It has great opportunities, great resources for students, but we lose that interaction. We're losing those interactive learning spaces that students should have access to. And typically, when you look up programs like Ingenuity, our most vulnerable populations are the ones that get plopped onto it first, or any learning platform. And while they're great, they're supplements, not substitutes. So we want them to supplement your learning, the learning the students are doing, not be a substitute for who you are and the incredible work that you do. Let's think about thought-provoking lessons. So this is where you can think about the travel bans, gun control, eugenics, these ideas that are very thought-provoking and can ignite that curiosity, that excitement, and get that argument, that fire going in our students. We want them to be excited, because once we get that fire turned on, they're hungry. They're wanting to dig more into what they're doing and making things really exciting for the students. And then we have interactive learning experiences. How do we teach in a world without grades and attendance? If you were to teach, and I had to do this during the pandemic, I taught where there weren't really grades that we were giving out, and we didn't really take attendance. So if you didn't have any grading or attendance policies, how would you teach? Would it change your teaching? Did your teaching change at all during the pandemic? If you taught during the pandemic, during 2020, did your teaching change at all that March and then the following year? What if your classroom was voluntary? Would students want to come to it now, the classroom you have right now? If they didn't have to come, would they come and join? And I've had to ask myself that question too, because times I'm like, yes, they totally want to join. And other times I'm like, oh, this lesson wasn't the greatest. They probably wouldn't have wanted to join and maybe wouldn't want to come back to the next day. And it's important that we have these thoughts and these questions and these ponderings during our instruction so that we think about how we're going to structure our learning space and how we're going to drive our learning spaces to the desire, the drive they want to learn versus compliance. And this is another way we can engage families and bring them into the learning experiences as well, because we know it's a team sport. We're in this together. Now let's think about the student work artifact that you want to create when you're looking at the student work. I urge you to look at the UDL placemat and look at the columns for action and expression and representation. When you're coming up with your student work artifact, ask yourself, what are the goals for this assignment? What are you wanting to know? And when there are learning gaps, and what happens if there are gaps in the learning? And how can students communicate their sense making? Going back to all the way back to Samantha's question, this was her artifact. She was able to see how students are interacting with this infographic. She's able to see how students are able to connect the concept of biodiversity to the concept of racial demographics in California. Personally, I think it's brilliant. I mean, I know she's a partner of ours, and so might be a little bit biased, but still think she's brilliant. And I do think that when we're able to combine those concepts, we're able to get more of that feedback from our students that we can in turn give them our feedback and helping them learn and move forward. And then we'll be able to get to this soon. We'll be talking about how to support your case study students in a couple slides and ways to make this exciting for those students. So just a quick note on some misconceptions. There's supposed to be a lens and not a checklist. I know I said that earlier in our time together, but I really want to reiterate that this is a lens and not a checklist. You're not going to go through things and be like, check, 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 done, 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 done. It's a reflective tool. And so as we're engaging in lesson planning, it's standards based, not standardized. So we want a tool where we can use it as a tool for reflection versus a single lesson to look at it and be like, done, check, got on. And I want to emphasize the idea of self-regulation. The idea that students are being able to have more ownership and agency of their own learning. So I want, as you think about this question, I'm going to pause and slow down. How do you create a justice-centered community in your classroom? What does it look like to you? Or do you create a justice-centered community? Or how do you create it? What does the justice-centered community look like? What does that sound like, feel like, look like to you? A justice-centered community. Pop it into a chat, into the chat, not the chat, the chat. What does it sound like, look like, feel like a justice-centered community for your classroom? Maybe it feels comfortable. Maybe it feels safe. What other ways could you describe a justice-centered community in your classroom? More inclusive circles, yes. Learning reflective of the knowledge of our community, yes. I love tapping into your community and having those really strong leaders, or even not strong leaders, come in and have that moment. I love restorative circles. Those are great. Respect with personal responsibility, being able to have autonomy. Yes, solving your own problems. Choice, curriculum that is inclusive. Love it. Yes, different perspectives. Love, love, love that. Thank you for sharing. So this is where we think about social justice. I'm going to share a tool with you, and you maybe have seen it before. It is the Social Justice Standards for Learning. I'll pop it into the chat. I'll give you a moment to click on that link. And when you look at the social justice standards for learning, it is a framework for anti-bias education. And you have identity anchor standards, diversity anchor standards, justice anchor standards, and action anchor standards. And there's about 20 standards you can look at. I love it. It's so wonderful and so user-friendly to look at. You can download it, dig deeper into it. It is, when you download it, it is laid out into grade level specific grade bands. So not specific, sorry, I shouldn't have said specific, not specific grade level, but bands. So middle school is all together, high school is all together. It's also a great way to look at that and look at different social emotional learning skills or traits that you want to dig into. Many schools and districts are looking at social emotional curriculum or checklist, but we don't like checklists. We want to make it a lens. So this is where you can incorporate social emotional learning for the students to think about empathy, community, and well-being, belonging as well. I'm going to give you another maybe 30 seconds to look at the social justice standards. Has anybody seen them before? I see some heads shaking. Yes. Great. Nice. Steph, thank you. They are wonderful. If you do not have experience with them, please go ahead and dig into them. Haley, too. Awesome. So here's an example of how to combine standards with justice. Let's say your standard is this next generation science standard, supporting an argument that animals get the materials they need for growth, chiefly from air and water. And then you have your social justice standards. Students will analyze the harmful impact of bias and injustice on the world historically and today. How would you combine these two concepts between the standards, and then the justice, both being standards? What do you think? Pop into the chat if you have some ideas on how you would combine those two, of the standard and the justice, that animals get what they need from air and water, and students analyze the impact of bias and injustice in the world. You may be thinking, it supports an argument that animals get the materials they need for growth, chiefly from air and water. And then you have your social justice standards. So a bug just flew at me, sorry. Students will analyze the harmful impact of bias and injustice in the world historically and today. The way I would think of it would be to look at it is the fact that animals and their plants, we can see the harmful impact of which systems have access to water and which ones don't. So you can look at that in that way of the access to plants and waters, and the injustice of some don't have access because of our human impact. We can also see this right now with indigenous populations, Native American populations fighting for their access to water. And we're still seeing that fight for access to water today. Child welfare laws, absolutely. So now I want you to take a moment to consider your context. All of us are coming from a different space and I'm assuming a different space, a different group of students that we're servicing. We want to connect our framework to your students, and how we connect our framework to your students and your community, and thinking about what the different demographics are of your school. Think about what resources you have. Hopefully you have many. I know it's tough sometimes, and that sometimes we don't have as many resources as we want. Think of where your child, this person that you really enjoy and that like you want to see them succeed. What's their community like? Where do they eat? Where do they gather? If you are out of the classroom, think of a previous student that you're working with, that you can encourage them and choose whatever student you want. I mean, it could be a previous student, maybe imaginary student, somebody you saw on TV, I don't know. But this is our case study approach. We start with thinking about a student or a few students in our classroom, and it allows us to dig deeper into the understanding of who they are. And the way we get to know our students is typically we look at their cumulative file. We talk to the teacher from the year before, we try to get the T on the students and look at some standardized testing scores, and that's how we frame our idea of who our students are. But we need to go deeper. Where did the student come from? What are their strengths? What are some difficulties? And some of this comes from their IEP, especially for the special education students. But we want to get to know our students away from knowing just what's on their IEP. We can dig deeper into the family dynamic, the interaction, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what supports have worked from previous educators and teachers. What does the student enjoy? What does the student not enjoy? The point is that I want to capture a very qualitative lens of our students versus the usual attendance assessments, report cards, behavioral reports. You know, we all get that stuff all the time. And we want to know what their hopes and dreams are, their stories, their ancestral stories. What are their goals? We should be able to capture this because once we're able to capture the data that's over here in the green, it's so much better and more deep into who they are. And we can get into our culturally responsive lesson planning. So the data we normally collect of attendance, assessments, report cards, we really want to shift into the new data for these focus students, these case study students. And that goes into the why behind your instruction. There's so many things on our plates, right? We talked about the do, know, think, the content, the cross-cutting concepts. We go into the environment. We got to think about social emotional learning. We have to think about ELD, culturally responsive teaching, academic discourse. The list goes on and on and on. And I'm sure your head is spinning and you're like, Jill, you've talked to us for so long. But I want us to start right in the middle, right in the phenomenon, and talk about how we're going to engage our students through this engagement piece. So phenomenon a few years ago to me, many moons ago, was a new word to me, and it could be puzzling to sometimes or confusing, but it is a puzzling event or process that sparks explanatory questions, and it allows for students to be able to make sense of the phenomenon using the concepts and skills learned during instruction. This is straight from Dr. Brian Reiser, and it's something that should be observable. It should be something that students can see, feel, touch, experience. It should be that they have that experience with it. When we think about the phenomenon, we want to think about what it is that's going to hook and get your students puzzled and thinking about new things. You want it to drive the 3 dimensions of learning, the do, know, think. It requires students to figure things out versus learning. So we want that inquiry base. This isn't just something that they can memorize of the quadratic formula or how to figure out slope, but really something that they have to figure out. It creates context and need for further inquiry. I want to know more. I want to dig into it. And then it also leads to questioning. Now, what is the why behind your instruction? This can be a case or a solution. It can be a problem. It could be a cause for wonderment, like, I wonder why that did happen. And the why behind your construction can be a case or a solution or solve a problem or wonderment. It could be studied across content areas like climate change. You can look at historical perspectives. You can look at the statistics and the mathematical perspective, all sorts of things. It's not just STEM. This is your direct opportunity for culturally relevance and culturally responsive relevance being the relevance to the content, the community, the news that you see, and responsiveness being the direct response to the cultural capital that your students bring in. And you can learn from the case study students and student analysis. So now I want you to think about it, leave it to you. What's your why behind your instruction? Can you connect it to the environment? What will ignite curiosity? What will ignite questions? Is there a real world experience or relevance? We have at STEM for Real a formula that's SHS, Standard Hook Society. Your standard is the content area. We know what standards are, right? It's the math standard, history standard. You think about it, your grade level standard, cross-cutting concept. What are all those things you want to think about and learn about? And then you pose the hook to the students. To my students, I found an image of the Flint, Michigan water crisis and the water coming out of the tap, of the faucet. So you can use this in a way to generate and ask questions. So you've got your standard, of understanding the environment and how things come together. Your hook is something that will really get those nails and start that fire burning within your students. And then finally, the society. What societal issue would you need, or would you, science needs you to understand that context? So through understanding, how can your students frame arguments? And then this is where you can choose a phenomenon that ignites that curiosity and now has a societal impact, making it relevant to the students that are in front of you. This is what we talk about when we look at our SHS. So we want to look at the society. One way to find a societal connection is to check Google News, see what topics are trending, your content or your subject area, survey your students, talk to families, talk to other educators. You can also look at Lena, Dr. Lena, a few years ago, looked at the New York water crisis and chemicals that were found in the drinking water, and having that so that it could compare to what safe drinking waters could be, and certainly all the different components of that to compare it to the Flint water crisis. And all this is makes us able to synthesize something that we've talked about and we've learned about in our classroom. We're able to summarize everything we've talked about here on this slide. I know it's been a lot of information, so thank you for sticking with it. When you're creating justice-centered pedagogy in your classroom, you want to make sure that you have a runway and the environment set up for the social justice culture. This means that your students are open and they're ready to know that the content that you're going to be teaching is connected to societal issues. You want to set your classroom for perhaps some sentence frames and sentence starters. I love Dr. Abram Kennedy's book, The Anti-Racist Baby, because you can see that these baby sentences per se, that they can lead to good set of sentence frames that you can use as conversation starters in your classroom. Then you have a whole phenomenon where you choose your phenomenon using your standard hook society. You have your phenomenon, then you think about the questions and the observations, and you pose them to your classroom. And now here you can do the STEM, right here, do the STEM. Here you can do the STEM. And I say do the STEM because we always talk about STEM. However, you can do the activity before content. Brainstorm the activities that allow students to generate evidence, ideas, and craft their arguments. And then I think that it's like a Mortal Kombat fight, but not really fighting actually, but intellectually. So explain and argue and have a prompt that allows your students to engage in the learning and have these responses and like dig into everything that they're doing and going on. So are we doing UDL justice? Here are some of the questions I want you to ask. Is science being taught? If so, how? And how regularly? Well, Jill, you might ask, why are you talking about science? I know you're a science person, but you're always talking about science. Yes, I am, because it's not always taught and compared. But we need to dig into these things. And we can do this for art and other music and other things that aren't taught as much because they're not tested. We really want to make sure to connect with families and learning and learning at the home. And getting to know our families. This is where we can look at the digital divide. How are teachers getting professional learning and culturally responsive, anti-bias and anti-racist teaching? Well, you're here. So hopefully now you have the framework, you have the social justice standards. And like Zaretta Hammond says, all teaching should be culturally responsive. It's how we're getting our learning and our professional development into the different systems that we live within. I'm going to jump really quickly to some examples of phenomenon because I know that's one area that people struggle with. So here's a quick topic on what phenomenon is. Like chemical reactions, not so exciting. Mentos and soda, super exciting. That's your phenomenon. That's your hook. That's your way to engage in the students in what they're doing. 3 branches of government, kind of boring. Brett Kavanaugh and the SCOTUS, and the drama going around behind that. That would be really interesting to look at the discourse that was going on between that and the discussions that were had. So in this presentation, we examined how we married universal design for learning with the 3D 5E to empower student voice and student choice. We also addressed equity and cultural responsive teaching by looking at the context of our schools, the districts, and looking at a case study student analysis very briefly. And we crafted our own cultural responsive phenomenon to drive student learning, thinking about our standards. On this slide, I have a few different resources that you can jump into if you're interested in digging in a little bit further. I'd love for you to keep this conversation going and have more of you interact with us, us being STEM for real. We want to hear from you, so please go ahead and go to, I'm going to pop it in the chat, It's the fastest way to get a hold of one of us at STEM for Real. I appreciate everyone hanging on just a few extra minutes. We will have these slides available for you. It will be emailed out along with this recording. So you can use it in your context. We want to hear from you. So please let us know what you thought about this presentation, and let's keep this conversation going. You can reach out to me at jill@stemforreal.org. You could also reach out to our team at info@stemforreal.org. And you can follow us at STEM for Real. We're on the newest platform of Threads. We'll see how long that keeps going. And you can always find us on our handle at STEM for Real, the number 4. And we really we at STEM for Real wish the best for you in your UDL journey. I would love to have more conversations with you and partner with you further to talk more about what your experience is with UDL and the justice standards. So please reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you